Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today, I wanted to dig into the James Bond character. James Bond as a character has existed across a spectrum over the course of his lifespan. He began as a literary character as envisioned by Ian Fleming, and subsequently has been reshaped with every cinematic actor to interpret the character for the screen. Some of those reinterpretations have been dramatic, and in fact, that sort of dramatic reimagining of the character began right at the outset with the casting of Sean Connery. Connery was largely considered to be miscast as James Bond before audiences saw him on screen. It's kind of hilarious in retrospect. Everybody tends to regard Sean Connery as the iconic James Bond, the singular person to really get James Bond right, the original model of the character, even more so than the figure in the Ian Fleming source material. But yes, when he was cast as James Bond, he was seen as a little miscast. James Bond in the novels was much more a representation of the English elite, and Sean Connery was a working class Scotsman. And in taking on the James Bond role, he added a sort of class ambiguity to the character that I think broadened the character's appeal internationally. I'm not here to rehash all the changes that occurred with all of the actors there, but you see that the character pushes and pulls over the years. Everything goes back, I think, to Ian Fleming. If you look at the source material, even from the first book, Casino Royale, the character is very much there. He's very much established in all of his fullness, but every subsequent interpretation of the character has chosen certain aspects of that character to emphasize more than others, sometimes push a little bit further. And today we're facing the reinvention of the character once again. The character is being reinvented for the video game 007 First Light coming out in March of next year, and then we also have a new Bond movie in the works. For my part, I feel pretty flexible about the nature of the James Bond character. I love all of the cinematic Bonds to date, and some of them have been pretty dramatically different from one another. You wouldn't naturally put Roger Moore's James Bond and Daniel Craig's James Bond in the same room together. They have very different personalities and personas. In functional terms, they are effectively different characters, but for me, they both equally feel like James Bond, and I want to give the same leeway to any future incarnation of the character to play with those attributes of the character, to have fun with the archetype, to find new colors and textures and shades in this version of the gentleman assassin. But since the new version of the character is going to be directly reacting on what came before, I think it might be worth pointing out what elements in the Daniel Craig era shouldn't be doubled down on and what should. I like Daniel Craig's James Bond, but I think there are elements of his character that it would be unwise to double down on in a future incarnation without risk of losing something intrinsic to the character. And similarly, I think there are elements of the Daniel Craig characterization that were underexplored. That one of these aspects that I'm not going to talk about too much because I've already talked a lot about it in prior videos is the return of the gentlemanly, charming facets of James Bond. This idea of a Bond who has a real bon vivant zest for life, this hedonistic, Epicurean 007 with a lot of charm and a lot of elegance. I'm not going to talk about that so much, but I am going to come at that from a slightly different angle. One of the respects in which the Daniel Craig version of James Bond rewrites the character is that in the effort to modernize the character for a new era, they really emphasized this idea of Bond as an SAS type, this sort of commando military figure. And some people have really connected with that element of Daniel Craig's James Bond. He feels very tactical. He feels like a hardened field operative. I think it added a very interesting flavor for Daniel Craig's James Bond because it kind of heightened this tension that has always been there in the series between Bond, the killer, and Bond, this elite gentleman who wears dinner jackets and enjoys fine cocktails and food. That tension is kind of exaggerated when you pitch Bond that way. But I think if you go back to Ian Fleming, there's actually a misconception about Bond's background. Bond's background in the novels is vague, but Ian Fleming does give us in his obituary in You Only Live Twice, where Bond is presumed dead, MI6 issues obituary, and Ian Fleming details some of Bond's childhood and his entry into the affairs of the Ministry of Defense, and they echo Fleming's own biography. Fleming obviously envisioned Bond as a quasi-autobiographical figure, a sort of fantasy version of himself. And it's important to remember that Ian Fleming was not of the upper class of the British class structure, but was part of the elite. He was well schooled. And because of his family connections, the way he entered the intelligence business was kind of bluffed his way using family connections into the Royal Naval Intelligence Organization, working as a office clerk. And he kind of worked his way into that organization and began to accumulate the position of a strategist as war operations took effect. And he gives Bond a version of that same biography. Bond just kind of leaps right from school right into the Ministry of Defense. There's not really this period that some fans think there was of Bond just being a true naval officer. Fleming is very clear that Bond is given rank in the Navy because he's joined naval intelligence and they need to assign him a role just to make him functionally viable as an intelligence clerk. But he's not really a serving field operative at this point. Now, Bond's overall career trajectory ends up being more tactical than Ian Fleming's actually was. Ian Fleming tended to stay behind the scenes. He was directing commando units, but he wasn't actually participating in them. The way Bond's future career goes, we're able to infer that Fleming's intention for us is to suspect that Bond participated a little bit more in the field operations of the Ministry of Defense during that World War II time period, and Fleming states that Bond desires to just kind of seamlessly carry on from his duties during World War II, and that's how he further ingratiates himself into the British intelligence system and ultimately becomes a 00 after killing 2 people and earning his 00 number. But there's this sense that Bond is much more a product of the intelligence world than he is of the military world, and he's living in the world of the broader intelligence community right from the start. So this emphasis on Bond being this very physical, tactile commando is a little bit askew with what Fleming originally envisioned. And I don't think pushing in that direction breaks anything. Obviously, in a modern context, when you were looking at characters like Jason Bourne and Jack Bauer that Bond was then trying to compete with, it made sense to really emphasize Bond as this sort of brute force weapon. But as a result of that, certain elements of the character got underemphasized. This idea that Bond is a character who adopts covers, who is a kind of investigator, who is an intelligent agent who isn't just sent out to kill, but is also sent to just kind of gather intelligence, figure out what's going on, like he is in the novel Dr. No, where he's just sent to investigate a disappearance of an agent, Strangways. This sense of Bond as being a little bit more of an intelligence veteran is lost. And I think we would continue to lose something of the Bond character if future installments just doubled down on this idea of Bond being a tactical operative. Bond should be a well-rounded spy. He might be fundamentally licensed to kill and authorized to kill in the appropriate circumstances, but that's not his singular job description. When characters in the films call him an assassin, it's kind of a pejorative in a lot of ways. And when we hear people reduce him to the idea of an assassin, it actually minimizes what he's doing. That's why so often in the Moore films, the Dalton films, people use that terminology to kind of demean Bond a little bit. He's a much more functional, blunt instrument, yes, but he is sent into complex situations to investigate and navigate them. And I think a lot of the stronger Bond narratives are the Bond stories where Bond is much more of a tactile investigator. The stories like From Russia with Love, where Bond is really navigating the intricacies of the spy world. And I think it's important that Bond not just be tactically capable, he should obviously be very proficient at using a firearm or getting into hand-to-hand combat. These are aspects that Fleming establishes in his original characterization of Bond. Bond is obviously seasoned and proficient in those avenues, but he should also be a thinking man, and he should also be an infiltrator, and he should also have some kinship with that broader cloak and dagger world. I think from the outset, the Daniel Craig Bond movies were reacting against what came before when they had him so scornfully throw away his code names and disguises and things like that and just kind of lay things out. And that's a very classically Bondian tactic, but I think it came at a detriment to some aspects of the character that I really like. And I think to push that even further, to say, let's just make James Bond this sort of John Wick like action man assassin who is just sent into situations to kind of tear his way through the scenery, loses a lot of the appeal of the character. The appeal of the character is often grounded in his ability to navigate situations with grace and cleverness and wit and charm. And I think in that way, we don't really want to see Bond become even more of the super commando. I think we actually need to see more of Bond, the intelligence officer. I actually think the upcoming video game 007 First Light seems to be having some fun with that tension, this idea that Bond is kind of this reckless figure, much like Daniel Craig's Bond at the start of Casino Royale. The young Bond of 007 First Light seems to be a little rough and tumble, a little rough around the edges. He's straight out of his own military career, launching into MI6. But there seems to be an emphasis in that game of Bond really learning how to do spycraft. There's a focus on that feels like a nice corrective from the Daniel Craig era, this sense of Bond infiltrating situations with complex factors at play and trying to navigate through them as cleverly as he can to find the information he needs to find. I think that is a nice corrective, and I hope Bond 26, the film, picks up that same sort of thread, that Bond, regardless of what his actual early background is, regardless of whether he's an SAS veteran or part of the Navy or however you want to directly shape the character's background, he should be part of a functional intelligence operation that functions in a fictionalized way like an actual spy organization. This Bond should just not be a standard action hero, but he should really be an infiltrator, an investigator, and skilled at extracting information in an efficient way. Bond should be a professional spy, essentially, is the thesis of this video. If I'm to summarize up my ramblings, Bond should be a professional spy, and they need to really continue to emphasize that going forward. Double down on the spycraft, double down on this idea of him being a working professional, even if it's in a fantasy setting, and emphasize that in both the video games. I hope that at the end of 007 First Light, he's really established as the seasoned spy that we need him to be, that kind of functionally continues to operate in that world. And I hope Bond 26 will establish the character in a way that grounds the character in basic spycraft and spy operations. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.